Hello and welcome to week 4's multimedia presentation. My name is Daniel Luke Gonzalez, and we are going to be discussing the literary canon. We are not going to be going in depth into each of the works. I have an accompanying handout that will go more in depth into each of the works, along with the recommended works by our professor. We are going to be covering A Room of One's Own, The Walls Do Not Fall, Infection in the Sentence, and Treason Art Text. Up first, A Room of One's Own. Okay, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own we have already covered. In fact, last week's presentation covered it quite well and quite in depth. So I'm going to be focusing more on the aspect of the literary canon. As it's been said from the work, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. This, of course, brings up a problem. Women often didn't have access to these things, and thus were underrepresented in the literary canon. I believe that we can organize this according to three main ideas found from Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. First off is, of course, money. Money often belonged to the husband or to the father. Women did not have access to money. Women did not have the right to keep their own money. Even if a woman was able to invest wisely, even if a woman was able to save, scrounge together and attempt to make a living, the money was the property of her husband, and the husband could do with it as he saw fit. Without economic control, without economic independence, a woman could not spend her time writing. Brings up our next point, privacy. Because women were so confined to the family and to the home life, the idea of a woman removing herself from the family, removing herself from the home life, was seen as anathema, was seen as unacceptable by the modern society and by modern culture. But yet, for writing, you need that ability to remove yourself from society, at least for a couple hours, to be able to sit down and properly write. But this privacy was not afforded to women. Which brings up our next point, society as a whole. Societal expectations said women were not allowed, to become writers. For a woman to be a writer, she could easily be written off as mentally challenged, mentally insane, as mentally in need of help, and thus sent off to a hospital, sent off to a mental asylum. Society said that a woman's place was not in the study, that it wasn't in the library, that it wasn't at the writer's desk. So all three of these things combined created a system, a society, a patriarchal literary canon in which women were just not allowed to participate, not because of women's inability to participate, but because the patriarchal system was designed to not let women participate in the literary canon. Up next, The Walls Do Not Fall. Basic overview of The Walls Do Not Fall is it's a poem written right around the time of Britain being attacked by Germany during World War II during the bombing runs. The question comes up, why is this poem being covered in our literary canon week? This is because in large part the poem deals with a lot of things concerning modern versus classic. In a world of tanks and bombs, what do you do with poetry? In a world of machine guns, in a world of chaos, in a world of anarchy, in a world where everything's being destroyed, where does classical literature belong? Throughout the poem, there's a lot of references between modern London and ancient cities. For example, Pompeii is mentioned directly. The ruins of Egypt, the tombs, the destroyed architecture, and then how London kind of mirrors that. A lot of references are made to classical works, classical religion, classical architecture, and there's this constant back and forth between the modern versus the classic. Then there's a transition to a word versus sword, and it's building off of this modern versus classic in which the word gave birth to the sword, but yet the sword is now trying to destroy the word. So the question comes up, where does the word belong in a world that's dominated by the sword? What advice does the word give us? What advice does poetry give us? Literature and fiction. All of these things are important questions to ask, especially in terms of how we are continually entering into modern worlds as we are progressing forward into a digital age, into an information age. What role does the book have in an age of Kindles? Could be a modern day take on some of these things. Up next, infection in the sentence. This is personally my favorite article from the week. I really enjoyed the writing from this. It talks about our sickness in society, a sickness in the sentence, a sickness that goes down to the very words in our book that prevent women, that have held down women from being able to participate fully in the literary canon. At the core of this entire article is Bloom's take on literature. Now, Bloom's take on literature is incredibly patriarchal, and we're going to deal with that a little bit more after I discuss the basic summary of it. So Bloom's take on literature is that the entire system is an Oedipus complex. A new person comes in, a male, who wants to become a new author. So he studies under the forefathers, he learns the grammar, the syntax, the genre, methods, all of these types of things. And in the process of learning these things, in the process of interacting with the forefathers, the new author starts to develop a sense of anxiety and an Oedipus complex. The father figure is, of course, the forefather, and the mother figure is literature itself, the literary canon, the muse, the female muse of literature. The new author realizes that in order to be seen as important in the literary canon, he must destroy the forefather, prove that he is better than the forefather, and then conquer the muse, as it were, and then stamp his place in history on the literary canon. This produces a sense of author anxiety towards the forefathers. So this is incredibly patriarchal, and there's a question of, well, why is this important to our feminist class? Many feminists would argue that we should just completely scrap this and destroy this entire take on literature. The authors of the article, though, argue that that's not what we should do. Instead, that Bloom's take on literature is accurate. It's patriarchal because literature has been patriarchal throughout most of its history in the Western world. And because of this, it should be seen as a lens through which to see literature and then to see how it is sick to the core. The authors argue that this represents that literature has a problem. Literature is so male-focused that it is very, very difficult for a female to participate in the literary canon. Case in point, the forefathers, Oedipus complex, this whole situation is male-focused. Sure, one could argue a switch over to an Electra complex, but then that brings up another problem. Who's the woman looking up to? There's not very many female literary authors, and most female works are judged based upon male works, not female works. So you can't just replace it with an Electra complex, but yet women are expected to be judged based upon the forefathers. This creates a barrier of entry to female writers. The second major focus of the article is the woman's role model in literature, in which throughout literature women have been presented as either maidens or monsters, one or the other. In which if a woman is not perfect, is not beautiful, is not all these different things, she must be evil. Because women in literature are there to serve basically one purpose: to interact with the male hero, to interact with the male protagonist. And as such, a female can basically only serve in one of two ways: to be the loving maiden or the evil monster to be defeated. So when a young female starts to read books, starts to interact with this literature, She walks away feeling like this is what I am, this is what I should be. The women in literature just don't really play a significant role. They're relegated to the sides. They don't get to take the main part in the plays. They don't get to be the heroes. They're just there to be won by the hero or to be defeated by the hero. Last one, trees in our text. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. This one's pretty straightforward. It's a historical kind of overview of different types, different approaches by feminists of the literary canon. You have on the one hand the aggressive approach, in which feminists argue that we should just completely get rid of any sexist works by men, and that we should focus instead on books and literature that uplift everyone. There's the other approach in which there's a merging between the traditional literary canon with men, and then women are added in kind of as equals, and then a book is judged based upon its merits. The article also goes into detail discussing issues and problems and challenges that arise when trying to incorporate things like works of women of color and works of lesbian authors and those of other sexual orientations. As a point of illustration to demonstrate some of the problems that arise with these different groups is the problem, of course, of gatekeeping. For example, with lesbian authors, the question comes up, what qualifies as a lesbian text? Is a text lesbian because it incorporates aspects of female-to-female relationships? Is a text lesbian because the author is lesbian? Is the text lesbian because it contains lesbian relationships? At what point is a book part of the lesbian literary tradition? But inherent within that question brings up another problem. The whole point of trying to deal with the literary canon and trying to incorporate these other works is because women were often gatekept. There was a gatekeeper preventing women from participating in the literary canon. So that even if a woman wrote a book, often she was ignored, or the book was sent and treated as not worthy of the literary canon because she was a woman. So then if a lesbian comes along and says, you must be lesbian in order to write a book for the lesbian literary tradition, is that not the same type of gatekeeping as it was for women in the first place? So these things are challenges to all these different types of literary traditions. And at the end of the day, the article argues that the reader should attempt to incorporate all forms of literature, even the sexist ones, and that a book should be judged and critiqued based upon what it says, based upon its content. That yes, a book can be famous, yes, a book can be part of the literary tradition, and still be a terribly, horribly sexist book. All right, that will be it for our discussion on these major works. Check the handout for the other works, and check the discussion for some questions related to these works on the literary canon. Thank you, and I hope you guys all have a good week, and I'm looking forward to seeing your responses in the blog post.